talks with Book TV from the 2010 Book Expo America in New York City. He discusses his memoir, Hitch 22, for half an hour.
Christopher Hitchens, who talked you into doing an autobiography?
I think it may well have been the person who wrote my obituary by accident. In the catalogue of the National Portrait Gallery in London a couple of years ago, there was an exhibit about a group of people, friends of mine and of Martin Amis's, a sort of set, if you like. And in the catalogue copy, it referred to the late Christopher Hitchens. And they were terribly upset and said, "Don't worry, we'll recall them all, we'll pulp the whole thing." And I said, no, I want several copies of that, because nothing focuses the mind like reading about yourself in the past tense. And it immediately dissolved any objection I had when I was asked to do a memoir, which is, well, isn't it too early? I think, well, I certainly can't leave it till it's too late. So there was that. And then I talked myself, excuse me, I talked myself into it a bit, because I didn't much mind being 40 or 50, I barely noticed it, but 60 hit me harder than I thought it would. And I found I was looking backwards quite a lot, brooding on things. So I thought this is probably the right moment to do it.
Why Hitch 22?
Well, I end up having described a lot of commitments I've had in my life and a lot of ideological battles I've taken part in, with a general polemic against certainty and against purity, against consistency, if you like. I'm no longer a member of any party or any ideological grouping, but I am associated with a group of skeptics who are sure of one thing, which is that nothing's for sure, and you're absolutely certain about the uncertainty principle. And so my Hitch 22 is that my commitment is entirely to doubt. So that's the idea. And then there was a game. I have a lot of word games in the book, some of them very puerile indeed, schoolboy humor, but getting better as time goes on. And one of them is a game invented by Salman Rushdie, where you have to think of a book title that didn't quite make it. For Whom the Bell Rings, for example, or Mr. Zhivago, or Good Expectations was another one, A Farewell to Weapons, Portrait of a Woman, and one that he contributed actually was Hitch 22, and I thought, yes, I think I might borrow that.
Death is a theme in your book.
Yes.
Why?
Well, because I begin with my own obituary, accidental obituary, then because it's not an autobiography exactly, but I thought that everyone, if they're doing a memoir, they have to do one chapter each about their parents. And death, I'm afraid, is a big subject there, because my mother took her own life in very tragic circumstances, very dramatic, tragic circumstances that I described. And my father was in the war business. He was a lifelong naval officer who'd had a very tough war. And I was brought up entirely on stories of chiefly British valor at sea, and on land and in the air. I mean, I can't remember how old I was until I realized that all television, all books, and all films were not about the Second World War. I thought they were.
You titled the chapter about your mother, Yvonne.
Yes, I called Yvonne, well, because it was her name, and because that's what I used to call her. She liked it. And because it's a nice name. And it's the way, when I think about it, I don't think mummy, I think, or mama, or I think Yvonne. We were very close, and I also used to think, because we came from a slightly drab part of English society, sort of lower middle class, with aspirations, naval and military, and my mother was a sort of failed milliner. She kept trying to open dress shops that never quite made it. And so the sort of the wives of my father's brother officers were called things like Ethel or Marjorie or Nancy or names like that. And I always thought when I was little that Yvonne had a touch of class to it. It was a little bit more cosmopolitan perhaps, a bit more stylish, a bit more soigné. And she was that in my life. I describe her as the gin in the Campari and the cream in the coffee. She was cheerful and humorous, and once said to me that the really only unforgivable sin was to be boring, which has haunted me all my life. Fear of bores, fear of becoming a bore or being boring. Terror, stark terror about tedium.
Do you have that fear?
Oh, yes. Yes, it's with me always. I think it's probably the most devastating word that one can use against somebody, or risk having used against yourself, yes. Don't be boring. Mustn't be boring.
This book is full of names, bold-faced names, as I say. I'm just going to throw some out and have you respond. Martin Amis.
Yes.
Who is he? What's his relationship to you?
Well, Martin is, as I'm sure a lot of your audience will know, is a brilliant novelist, both of humor and of gravity. I mean, he's written novels about the Holocaust and about the Gulag Archipelago, but he's also written, I think, his best humorous one, best known one, is called Money, which is a study of sort of Anglo-American degeneracy and at the cusp of the 1980s, in which I appear once or twice, fairly heavily disguised. And he's my best friend and has been since we were in our 20s. And a chapter of the book is basically a sort of love letter to Martin. And I'd say in that chapter that the question I'm trying to answer is, phrase it like this: can you have a heterosexual relationship with another guy? I don't know whether you can or not, but I decided to give it the sort of old college try. And I described the influence he had on my writing, the way in which we used to have very long, languorous, very tender, very intense discussions about women, the inexhaustible subject. And I show how you can make lead into gold. As I describe a visit we both made to a terrible massage parlor brothel outfit in New York, which he had to go to because his character in Money, John Self, had to go and expose himself to this. So it was field work, and it was the most intensely sordid and horrible and depressing, shameful, really, morning of my life, I think. And for him, too, absolutely ghastly. You can read it in Money. I even give the page reference. And I thought, when I read that section, John Self's fiasco in the massage parlor, I thought, well, that whole morning of squalor and misery has now been sort of totally redeemed. It's become literature. It's an almost Proustian moment. You can get wasted, lost time back and feel it wasn't squandered after all. So, I don't know if I'm giving you a hint, but I mean, he's been a great source of enthusiasm and risk and so on in my life.
James Fenton, you dedicate the book to him.
James changed my life when I met him at Oxford in the late 60s, where we were exact contemporaries. He is, I think, easily the finest poet writing in English, at least of his generation now. And probably best known to your audience for the poems he wrote from Indochina. It's a surprising thing when you think about it. There's almost no poetry generated by the Vietnam War, or if there isn't a poem everybody knows, as there have been poems from other wars. The best is written by James. I quote some of it. And he, as well as Martin and a few others, taught me that there was more to writing and more to journalism than polemic. You know, I used to think that the test of a good article was how well I'd argued the case, how well I'd sort of laid out the arguments for the left, how bad I could make the right wing look, how I'd marshaled the arguments. It was all very didactic. And though James, like me, was very much to the left, to him it mattered much more how the article was written, making every word count, using irony and understatement and humor. And we actually even wrote a couple of articles together, the only time I've ever done a joint byline with anybody. And he was immensely influential on me in that way. I think prevented me perhaps from becoming boring, to revert to the death trap subject.
Peter Sedgwick.
Yes. Peter Sedgwick would be less well known to your audience, but he was He was a Marxist intellectual of a very rarefied kind. In other words, he was one of those people who was of the left the left against the left, very, very anti-Stalinist, very much against some of the cult figures of the 60s, like Herbert Marcuse and R.D. Laing, who were being much bandied about. They were conjuring names when I was beginning to cut my teeth. He thought the 60s were probably a bit of a false promise. The counterculture didn't interest him very much. He was a scientist, he was a psychiatrist, believed in objectivity, wasn't easily swayed. Introduced me to the sort of dissident Marxist tradition of writing, Rosa Luxemburg particularly, some of Leon Trotsky, George Orwell, the great C.L.R. James, the great West Indian historian who wrote the best, really the only book on the Haitian Revolution. It's called Black Jacobins. Fantastic book about the slave rebellion in Haiti, and also, incidentally, was the best writer on cricket that's ever been produced by the British Empire. An odd thing for a revolutionary to be doing, but that was the thing about Peter. He introduced you to idiosyncratic types, the sort of tradition of the revolutionary left that got buried by the Hitler-Stalin Pact and by the Cold War, and which had something of a revival in the 60s and 70s.
Salman Rushdie.
Well, Salman, I devote a whole chapter to him and to his cause, because I was just getting to know him. I'd become a friend of his when he suddenly became even more famous than he thought he was going to become, and even more well known for his writing, all at one go, rather unfortunately, by dint of getting an incredibly bad review from the Ayatollah Khomeini, who, as well as not content with a bad review, offered money in his own name to suborn Salman's murder. An unbelievable sort of frontal attack on civilization. So for many years he had to go into hiding and be off the map. And there were a number of us who were very proud to be his friend at that time and sort of arranged to keep in touch with him, to keep up his spirits. He was afraid at one point, not so much that they would find him and kill him, but that the effort of staying alive would mean he couldn't write. Turns out he was wrong to fear that. He's written a lot of great stuff since then. He's a very emblematic figure of the 20th century, the idea of the intellectual migrant, the person who's at home in two continents. It's incredible to me that English is only his second language. His first language is Urdu. He writes it, and I would certainly say speaks it, really better than any native speaker does. And, as I say, he hugely improved the level of our rather childish, schoolboyish word games. I'll give you an example. He was once asked, without any preparation, what would a Shakespeare play be titled if Robert Ludlum was titled? I won't tell you how that all came up, it takes too long, but just picture, if you will, Robert Ludlum naming a Shakespeare play. So someone said, okay, try me, and we said, okay, Hamlet. And he said, the Elsinore Vacillation. Just like that, unbelievably clever. I said, okay, I bet you can't do that twice, with Macbeth, say. He said, the Dunsinane Deforestation. For Othello, the kerchief implication. For the Merchant of Venice, the Rialto Sanction, or like that. There are some more in the book. He has a real hold on English literature. He loves it and really knows it. And in addition, as if that wasn't enough, he's become one of the great symbolic figures in the battle over free expression, which never ends. I mean, we never thought perhaps we would have to defend the First Amendment against such an incredibly, fantastically violent, literally fundamentalist assault. But I think it was right to notice when the hour had struck when it did. Proud to have had anything to do with that. Go on at length about it in the book.
Taking the citizenship test.
Oh, yes. Yeah, shortly after 9/11, I realized I've been living in the States for a long time, more than 2 decades, nearly 3. I had a green card that was so old that it didn't have an expiration date on it. It was one of those old ones they used to give out. A platinum green card, you might say. I had 3 American children, an American wife. It's unlikely I'd get deported. And I had a European Union passport and a green card. I could have gone on like that, happily being sort of Anglo-American for the rest of my days, but I began to feel I was sort of cheating on my dues. That I really felt a strong solidarity with American society after that appalling attack on it just down the road from here. And began to feel much more like an American, even, strangely, to feel more like a Washingtonian. I mean, Washington was more like my base, I used to think. Strong identification. So I applied. And, well, it's got very hard to do the paperwork these days. And they kept on making appointments and then breaking them and putting them off. But anyway, then they sent me an exam, which I think even had the answers in it about questions you might be asked at an interview. And some of them were rather trivial, like, what are the advantages of becoming an American citizen? You wanted to think there would be something noble could be said there. You looked at the answers given by the official domain. It said, you can apply for a job in the federal government, and you can bring your relatives in from overseas. Well, one would hope the United States could say a bit more for itself than that. Then there are questions where you mustn't try and be funny, like, against whom did we fight in the American Revolution? Well, I think the answer is the usurping Hanoverian royal family that had usurped power in Britain, but the correct answer is the British, so you have to get all that right. It was a bit dispiriting, but I sat up the night before, not in any fear of failing the exam, but I just sat up and read through the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And I have a section in there about how you can read off the whole history of America by looking at the dates of those amendments, the ways in which they came about. And it's very nice because, A, it's nice in itself because it actually does demonstrate progress, which sometimes you wonder about. Second, or have doubts about. Second, it shows why this is such a great country for a writer, because it's based on written documents, which are deliberately there in order to expose themselves to rewrite. They're work in progress. They can be revised. So that the words and the music of the words and the meaning of them and the legality of them are all very important. And that's a unique privilege, I think. So then I was able, by good luck, to get the Department of Homeland Security to allow me to have my ceremony, take the oath, at the Jefferson Memorial in Washington, D.C., on his birthday, the 13th of April, which is also mine. And I'd by then written a short biography of him. And I held a copy of the Virginia Statute on Religious Freedom, which was one of the 4 things he wanted to be remembered for. And that was a wonderful day. It really was.
Sylvia Plath.
Sylvia Plath keeps on coming up in my story because she wrote about 2 things. Well, she didn't write about suicide, she committed suicide, but she's the occasion of an enormous number of books about female self-destruction. And I don't just write a chapter about my mother's self-slaughter, suicide, but I also write a coda, a short chapter, reflections on suicide. And the Plath story keeps coming up in that. And then in one of her most famous lines, it's in The Bell Jar, she describes her family coming from some manic depressive hamlet on the German-Polish borderlands. And it so happens that that's where my mother's family comes from. It was a secret kept in my family for a long time. I didn't find it out till I was about 30. But my mother's family was of Jewish descent from what is now Poland but was then Germany. You know, it's always very horrible when that border moves at any time in European history. Terrible things happen when that border changes. And I have a chapter on why I think it is that she kept it a secret from my father and from her 2 sons and from everyone she knew almost. She died before we could have the conversation. And I make a roots trip. I go to Poland, find the old shtetl, and see if I can find any traces of any remaining relatives. No, it's a clean sweep. They're all dead. They've all been murdered by fascism. And so the Sylvia Plath's concept of the manic depressive Hamlet becomes very alive to me on that trip.
Peter Hitchens.
Peter Hitchens is my younger brother. He was born 2 years after me. Slightly too close, perhaps. I used not to notice about things like birth order and all these articles you read about, but I actually now think it's quite important. And things for potential parents to think about. If you have a brother who's more like 18 months younger than me, he's too close to be a baby brother, but close enough to be a rival. For, of all things, my mother's attention. My God, imagine how I must have felt. I don't remember it, but I'm told that I became very jealous, and I can believe it. And as siblings, we've never been very close. We haven't lived in the same town since we were quite small. He lives in Oxford now, and he's a very well-known newspaper columnist and broadcaster in England of the extreme right. He's also very well known as a Christian believer. In fact, he's even written a book. I hope you'll do something about it. It's coming out this month or so. It's called The Rage Against God. The subtitle is How Atheism Led Me to Faith, and it's in part an extended dialogue with me for my unbelief. And for me, anyway, the biggest difference I could have with anyone is, no matter, all political differences are absolutely dwarfed by the difference between those who believe there's a supernatural dimension, like him, and those like me who do not. And it's the basis, really, of all other arguments. I mean, that's where philosophy begins. That's where arguments about biology actually begin, too. So he is, I have to say, a very good writer. He is a Hitchens, after all. He's a very serious person, I think a bit more solemn than me, perhaps. And when I say right-wing, I mean genuinely right-wing. In other words, he's people who regard things like the argument over Iraq, for instance, as a left-right one, I always think have it wrong, because in my experience anyway, the Iraqi and Kurdish left, who are friends of mine, were all in favor of removing Saddam Hussein. Large numbers of the American right, people like Pat Buchanan, as you know, the so-called Kissinger realists and so forth, generally against it. And the same is true of a kind of isolationist conservative force in Britain, of which my brother is a part. And he actually at one point says the war in Afghanistan is the sort of stupid left-wing war that only someone like my brother could possibly support. And there's more truth in that, I find, than in the rather cheap allegation made that if you are in favor of the liberation of Iraq, you somehow become right-wing, which I also try and deal with in the book. I have a chapter about my experiences in Iraq going back to the 70s.
On the back of your book are the typical blurbs that a book would have, and Christopher Buckley, for instance, says that you're the greatest living essayist in the English language.
Very sweet of him.
Gore Vidal's, if he wished to nominate a successor, he writes, an inheritor, a dauphin. I have decided to name Christopher Hitchens. That's on here, but it's marked out.
Yes. Well, Gore rather took that back the other day. We had a very big falling out over 9/11, where he made the, I think, disgraceful suggestion that it was an inside job in which the administration had taken part. I can't, that's more than a difference over politics. It's not a difference of emphasis. I find that untakeable, that sort of talk. And so he made a couple of rather sour remarks about me. At one point, even seeming to suggest that I'd made that statement up. At any rate, it seemed to me he was taking it back. So I thought, well, I won't wait for him to take it back. I'll take it back myself. But I did it in as waspish a way as I could. He is said to like a feud. Well, I mean, I think he should have one.
Chris Hitchens.
Yes, the bane of my life. My ugly younger brother. I've tried to obliterate him ever since I was small. My mother hated people calling me Chris. If your next name is Hitchens, Chris Hitchens means the H is always bound to go. It's pretty vulgar. Christopher's a nice name. Chris isn't. I say that even though Christopher Buckley calls himself Chris. I wish he wouldn't. Christophe, actually, is what I call him. We compromised on that. People at school would try and call me that. And it can be very difficult in America because people here are fantastically friendly and they like to get to first name terms very fast and then shorten them to be even more friendly, almost before you've got to know them. So unless you quickly say, actually I'd rather you said Christopher, you're going to sound like a snob or someone who's, repudiating friendly advances. So it's a constant battle for me. And I think now I've won it because people don't call me Chris anymore. No one who knows me at all does. And anyway, a lot of my friends call me Hitch at last, which is the other reason for the title. And I discovered when I went to my father's naval reunion. He took me to a reunion of his old shipmates years ago before he died. Rather touchingly. I think it was the last reunion they were going to have, these old sea dogs. And I noticed that they all called him Hitch. I'd never known that before. That was what my friends were beginning to call me. So that's another reason, another fold or wrinkle in the title.
What was the process of writing a memoir like for you?
Well, it was a good bit harder than I had expected it would be. And I tried to work out why it was giving me such a hard time, and there are 2 or 3 reasons, I think. One, usually when I write, I'm trying to make a case, or push an argument. Not always, but most of the time. Or at least I know exactly what I'm doing. I'm trying to describe a foreign country, say, as best I can. I've done a fair bit of that. With this, I'm not making a case. I'm not making an argument. It's not an apologia. So the sort of style of writing gets a little softer, perhaps, if you're not careful. And then, again, I would normally be trying to see how much I could pack into a given number of words. 5,000 for an article, say, or a long essay might be more, or a short book would be 90,000. How much you can press into this. When you're trying to remember things, if you're like me, who has a very good memory, you may well find you're remembering more than you thought you would, and then you think, I must get this down while it's still in my cortex. So things start to balloon rather alarmingly. You're not being terse at all, you're being very discursive. And that was another difficulty. I turned in almost twice as much as the publisher originally asked for. I'd never done that before. And then, of course, innate in it, you don't know how it's going to end. Or to be exact, how to end it. I had a very hard time wrapping it up. I didn't know really when I was done. In fact, I'm not done. I wake up every day thinking, damn, I should have put that in, or I should have put that differently. But more often than not, something I remembered that it's too late to put in now. People say it's a good sign. It gives me the blues, but book is probably dull. If you're still writing it in your head, it may have some vitality to it. Hope so, anyway.
Christopher Hitchens, his memoir, Hitch 22.
This weekend on Book TV's In Depth, noted feminist, author, and legal scholar